Welcome to Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks, a show that provides extraordinary insights for product managers who want to go faster and farther in their product management careers.
Hello, this is JJ Rory, Vice President at Sequent Learning Networks. In our Masters of Product Management podcast, we tap into the experiences of people who work in and around product management to help you learn and grow in your product management career. We hear a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the business world today. This is a welcome conversation in a time when there are still many examples of a lack of diversity in various sectors and industries, a level of exclusion, intentional or unintentional in many products, and frankly, outright oppression in many circles of society. Some of these DEI efforts seem to be hitting the mark, and some, frankly, not so much. So while I'd love to say this wasn't a difficult thing for companies, and it would not need to be such an effort for companies to ensure that they have a diverse, representative environment, the truth is many companies are still struggling a bit with how to define themselves in this context. What do they stand for, and how do they build a culture around diversity, equity, and inclusion? That's what our discussion is about today, how organizations and the product folks within organizations can build equitable products. My guests today are Carrie Jenkins and Amanda DiDio of Substantial, a world-class digital innovation and build studio known for partnering with future-driven organizations to create meaningful services, products, and cultures. Carrie Jenkins is CEO of Substantial. She is passionate about the intersection of ethics and technology and deeply invested in fostering open dialogue about the influence technology can have on our lives and its role in solving some of society's greatest challenge. Amanda DiDio is the Director of Engagement for Substantial, where she helps clients stay focused on end-user needs and business goals while still pushing their ways of thinking about how to solve problems with technology and how to build digital solutions with an understanding of their impact on the world. Carrie and Amanda, thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
You bet. Looking forward to this conversation. It's a really important one. So, Carrie, I want to start with a question for you. Building more equitable products. What does that mean exactly? How are you seeing organizations embrace the edict to build equitable, ethical, inclusive products?
So this is sort of the short answer, which is I like to think about building equitable products is about focusing on the why and the how as much as the what. And in my mind, a good way to break this down is to think about the product you're building and the ecosystem that it lives in, right? So this is the intended users, of course, they're in the ecosystem, but it also includes any other actors and agencies and the factors that affect the ecosystem. So that includes things like access or marginalization, vulnerability, but also could include things like compliance. And so ideally, a product would be created with its effect on that ecosystem, like thoroughly explored, right? That would mean understanding outcomes far beyond product market fit. That would require prioritizing outcomes beyond revenue and growth. And that's really something that most product cultures are still not doing. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I could certainly go into what the quest for VC funding does to product cultures, what the largest corporations in the world are doing to product cultures. But I think maybe getting more specific about what I mean in this instance could help here. So for instance, let's think about healthcare. There's a ton of new products getting built in healthcare. There's a lot of good that can be done in the healthcare space. And I use a particular case study a lot because I think it can really clarify what I mean by an ecosystem. So let's say you're building a product to assist doctors in determining what to prescribe for certain diagnoses. So you might think the doctor and their needs are the most important factors. Or more cynically, and frankly more likely, you might think that the pharmaceutical company that has the most revenue opportunity are the needs to prioritize. That's your quickest route to revenue, right, and growth. But what about insurance companies? They're in that ecosystem. Pharmacies are in that ecosystem. Caregivers are in that ecosystem. Regulatory entities are in that. All of those are agencies in that ecosystem. But the most important needs to prioritize are none of the above, because in healthcare, the outcomes for the patient should be the priority. And that is far more complicated because that isn't where the money is. And really serving the patients requires understanding their vulnerabilities, their demographics, the mitigating factors, and their long term needs. And so if you think about a product that helps a doctor prescribe faster, what have you achieved? Well, you've achieved more time for the doctor. So if the doctor is your primary customer, that's a win. You've definitely achieved more prescriptions. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. So if the pharmaceutical company is your customer, that's a win. But you've also created behavior changes across that entire ecosystem and all sorts of unintended consequences like overprescribing and diminished care. And in this case, a very real addiction problem that we've seen across the country. And it's just one example that fed into that addiction problem. I'm certainly not blaming the entire opioid addiction problem on this one product, but it's a really clear example of how a product was built to serve a very specific customer within the ecosystem while trading off and diminishing the care that was given to the most important person in that ecosystem, which would be the patient. And so to answer your other question is like, are we seeing organizations embrace building more equitable and ethical inclusion products? I can tell you, we don't see enough of them for sure. And I think that's because the trade-off to do so, it really requires sacrificing some time to market some of the time or speed to scale. And when we look at really large technology companies, which we are sort of simultaneously lionizing as technologists, but also vilifying because we can see the outcomes of the scale that they work within, they are affecting trends all the way across the industry. And for me as a leader, I can honestly say I'm really concerned about the hundreds of thousands of product people, the product managers, the product designers, the product developers who have learned over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, that the most important thing is revenue and growth above all else. Because those people might work just for large organizations right now, and we might think we can compartmentalize the negative effects on those very, very large global organizations. But these are also the people who are going to create all of the next startups. These are people who are going to go work at other companies. So the habits that we have instilled, the values that we have instilled over the last 20 years have affected a diaspora of technologists. And let's be frank, the majority of them are white, and they are also going to be the job creators of the future, right? They will go on to build other products. And so when I think about this problem, when I think about ethical creation and innovation, I really like to think about it at the micro level as much as the macro level, which is that each individual technologist can play a role in building more ethical products, regardless of where you work, regardless of what your role is. You have more agency than you think you do. And frankly, you wield more power than you think you do in most cases. So all of that being said, which I know wasn't the most positive spin on things, I am hopeful that we're turning a corner. And the reason being is that there's absolutely growing awareness. I've been out in the community talking about this now for going on 2 years. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of really positive response when these conversations happen. Even when they don't agree with me on the minutia, there's a lot of positive response in the conversation. And it's substantial. We are increasingly seeing customers come to us who want help in this space, like specifically coming to us to partner with them to help them shore up. And this is some of the largest companies in the world. I'll just leave it at that. Some of the very largest companies in the world, the kind of companies that are really at the forefront of the ethical challenges we're seeing in technology right now, have sought out a partner to help them shore up their ethical workflows and practices. And I think that's a really positive sign.
Yeah, I do too. I'm really excited to hear that because I think it starts with a recognition that we organizations don't understand quite what to do, right? And that's sometimes we don't even want to admit that. So the fact that organizations are kind of admitting that they need help in this area and that it's an important area is the first step. And I love what you say there. I think it's a really great point. We in the product world, and I've been in product management most of my career, we live in this output driven environment and world, and the way that for-profit organizations and for-profit product organizations have been set up is with this equation of the leadership gives their currency is funding for our projects, and our equation back to them, or our currency back to them, is tangible outputs, right? And tangible output is product units, revenue, profitability, right? And that's the world we've all lived in, and none of us are terribly comfortable with understanding that intangible outcomes, right? And those are some of the things we're talking about now, which is a different thing than an output, if you know what I mean. And so I think organizations have to get used to that and have to get used to some uncertainty around that before we can really tackle this. And so I like how you're thinking about it from a macro perspective, but also micro. It's going to take some tactical on the ground examples and case studies to make this work, and then ultimately, hopefully, build within each organization out there.
Exactly. And the thing about ethics and ethical innovation is that it's a practice. It's not a precise science, right?
Yeah,
that's right. They teach ethics, with case studies and philosophy, basically, and so you really do have to think about it as a practice, which means sometimes it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's going to feel uncertain. Sometimes it's going to feel ineffective, frankly, and sometimes it will be ineffective. But you have to continue to build that practice in and shore it up and make it a part of product creation from start to finish, right? I say this a lot, like ethical practices cannot be isolated in your design practice, for instance, right? Because think of all the decisions that happen in product before and after design is involved. And while a lot of practitioners who specialize in ethical work, whether it's research or design, are designers by practice, right? I think a lot of the leading work in this area is being done in the design field. It really needs to be built in throughout the organization at every level, which again, why I like to focus a lot on even individual contributors in the product world, because they are a part of that process. They are a part of all of those decisions that lead to the outcomes we're talking about. And it's important to think with that mindset.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to dig a little bit here. And Amanda, I'm going to turn to you. What are some ways that you've seen companies ensure that products or services being created are going to end up being inclusive and equitable in a sustainable way, right? Because there may be some, as we've talked about, some ways to build products that may have unintended downstream impacts. So what are you seeing companies do to ensure that equity?
I think the first way that comes to mind for me is really shifting the power balance and starting with bringing your end beneficiaries, those who are your end users, really part of the core and center of your formative research and even evaluative research to really think about bringing in their perspective and making it a participatory process and co-created experience for them, so that you're empowering, and elevating their voice, and that it's a continuation. It doesn't just stop and start, or start and stop with, research with them. It continues through the entirety of your build process. And so, I think where it becomes a more equitable process is when companies and organizations and those who are the technologists, boots on the ground building this product, are acknowledging and actively understanding their own biases and privileges when working with your end beneficiaries as part of that process, and then taking it further and understanding where there are risks and really striving towards driving more equitable outcomes of that. So it's really about shifting that power balance and making it more of a collaborative process and practice, and having, those who you are serving through what you're building a core part of that. And especially, to Carrie's point, those audiences who are the most vulnerable. And it does not, to her point as well, start and stop with that design process. It's not siloed in design, but it absolutely needs to be happening throughout the course of how we're building our products, and that they're there to keep us honest about how we're building and what we're building through an experiential perspective, but then also really evaluating where there might be some of those unintentional harms through the technology that we're choosing. And so, I think it really becomes a responsibility, and those organizations who are shifting a mindset of that are the ones that I think we're going to hopefully see it come to more life through a more sustainable product at the end.
Yeah, that's really important, because we all know that, well, most of us are aware that we have, in many instances, teams of people who are building technologies and building products who may not be the most diverse, right? There's a lot of chatter, rightfully so, on a lack of diversity in technology, et cetera, whether it's, women or people of color, LGBTQ, et cetera. And so when you start with a foundation of people building that may not look like the full representation of folks out there, then you're starting from a place of bias. Again, not intentionally, but you are. And so to bring the right people to the table is one of those most important things. I think that's right on. It reminds me of just a quick example. It reminds me of a product that Citi put out, I think last year, maybe, or in the last couple of years, called True Name. And it's a card targeted to transgender people, because I think up to almost 30 or 40% of transgender people have their birth name as their legal name still, right? Kind of their dead name, if you will, not the name that they prefer and identify as today. Well, with legal documents and products like a credit card, they would have to have the name that they didn't identify as still on there. And so Citi came up with using their own internal employee base of the LGBT employee resources group as part of the group sitting at the table designing this product. What can we do to solve some of those problems? And they came up with a card where you can put any name you want to on it, right? And that is real life-changing stuff for transgender people. So I love that you see companies doing that, and that you guys at places like Substantial are trying to show the light to organizations to bring more people to the table. So that's really great. So Amanda, another question for you, if you want to take it. Carrie, jump into too if you have any insights. But specifically, I want to dig into product managers. That's a lot of the folks listening right now are product managers. So where do you see kind of the role as a product manager playing in ensuring that these new innovations are ethical? Like what can we do specifically as the folks at the center of at the orchestration of building these products? What can we do internally to make sure that we're making a positive impact with our technologies and products?
I think it's the acknowledgement that, we don't need to be ethics experts to have an impact. And as leaders on our teams, and having that opportunity, right, to be able to work across disciplines and be the connective tissue to stakeholders and those who are making decisions, by taking on that responsibility and being invested to lead with that empathy, and asking those very hard questions along the way about how your product and solution or what you are building will be ingested by the world. What are those outcomes? And really taking the moment to almost challenge and sometimes be that voice in the room for your users. And I think that oftentimes, folks who are in this role think that, maybe it's not my responsibility, or that, this is kind of the role or space where design is going to take place, or development. And that's not the case at all. I think it's every step of the way of how we're driving our decisions is where product owners can absolutely lead and drive the dialogue, and then also think about different aspects of what is in their control to continue to create sustainability of products once they're launched and beyond.
Needing to know that you don't have to be an ethics expert to make an impact. I think that's really, really important what you just said. I think people get, and product managers and people in general sometimes in this area get a little paralyzed by fear of doing the wrong things or saying the wrong things. And I think that's a really important point to everyone listening. We don't have to know everything, but know that as product managers, we're kind of at the center of bringing the right people together and making the right steps. It's a progress. It's a journey. And don't be afraid of doing the wrong things or be afraid that you don't know everything you should know. So I think that's a really great point there, Amanda. Thank you for sharing that. That's important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I think that's true for product managers across the board in all aspects of their career, honestly.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask the wrong question. But in this case, I also feel like product managers really have a special role in driving culture on their team. And the culture of the team, I think, is as important in ethical creation as the process, right? And the intention, even. So when you think about who really is going to drive a culture of asking critical questions and engaging in critical thinking about the decisions that are being made for a product manager is uniquely set up to do that, both because of what Amanda pointed out, that they are typically holding a lot of perspective from the users and the customers, if the users and the customers are two different parties. And so they really are in a position to bring that insight into decision making and to really drive the feeling that it is okay to question objectives, incentives, and intentions with every decision we make. And right, it's all those little decisions that can build up into a situation with unintended consequences. It's both the big decisions that maybe are happening in a different room, like the monetization strategy and the scale strategy, and it's all the little decisions too. And I was a product manager for many years. I love product people, and I really do think that this idea of making it okay to ask questions and hear the answers that you might not be that thrilled with is a far better culture than not asking the questions at all.
That's right. That's right. And just to piggyback on that a little bit, my final question is, what other words of wisdom would you give to those of us involved in creating product managers specifically, but others as well? What to watch out for, maybe specifically, or are there specific questions to ask? Anything of that nature that you would kind of give as advice for product folks?
Yeah, there's a couple things, and it both touches on, I think, two of the themes of the things I brought up before. One is take a hard look at the culture that you are creating, and regardless of what your role is, really think about the environment that you are creating in. How is your team incentivized? How much do you understand the core objectives of the product you are creating in detail? And how much is speed and revenue and growth affecting the decision making? And really ask those questions of yourself first. One thing every single person can do is ask themselves those questions and sort of sit with the answers. And I'll tell you something, those of you out there listening who are working at the really large technology companies or even some of the fast growing startups, I understand that power dynamic can feel really off. And the reason why I think that people can be more scared than they care to admit about doing this kind of work is because they're working for companies that they feel like the core objectives of that company is very far from their day-to-day, right? And these companies employ lots and lots and lots of people. And so you feel like a cog in a wheel. But I really would encourage every team to employ the ecosystem exercise where you, with a whiteboard, if you have nothing else, it doesn't have to include your design practice, although it will be richer probably if it does. But map out the ecosystem your product is sitting in, the present day ecosystem. So if it's an existing product, you know what that is. If it's a product to be launched. You're still figuring that out maybe, but map it out. Every single agency in it. And then ask yourselves what the next 1, 3, 5, maybe 10 years, but that's probably too far. What effects time and the current trends in technology are going to have on that ecosystem? And this is a bit of a guessing game, which is nobody's favorite thing to do, right? Because guessing feels, right, like it's magic, which is why if you can really do some deep research to do this, right, you will get better results from this. But I promise you, just having a better understanding of your ecosystem is a really, really good start in understanding unintended consequences and understanding who your product is really serving and who it might be making trade-offs to. And then a question I always ask product people is if they could be 100% transparent about all of the objectives and intentions of the product they're working on with all parties in that ecosystem. And I promise you, I get a lot of questionable answers and looks when I ask that question. And you know who you are out there, right? If there's something about your product you cannot be transparent about, I cannot say anything other than that is a red flag. It just is. And again, you might not think you have any power, but even in a large organization, your team structure should give you some space to ask questions, to examine the parts of your product that you think are red flags, and to talk about that. And if you're feeling unsure about that, if you're feeling vulnerable about that, it is probably the power dynamic. And all I can say is that those very large paychecks and those very large equity packages come with a price, right? They are instilling in you that power dynamic by connecting you to those incentives. And you have more power than you think. This is an insane market right now for technologists. There are so many jobs out there that a person can have. So I would encourage you to not accept that power dynamic, even if you've accepted that large paycheck and the equity. And I would try to say, like, if the paycheck and equity is really important to you, and I completely understand that, right? Then try to change your culture from within. That is the responsibility you have as a technologist. That is what you should in return give to that organization in exchange for that paycheck and equity. And if you can't change that culture from within, leave the company or create your own and be more committed to ethical creation. But what you can't do is stay and say you didn't know. Because in truth, you didn't ask.
Yeah. Wow. Those are some truth bombs. I love it. So important and such good advice. Yeah. And I know there are people out there listening right now that really resonated with. And, again, nothing wrong with wanting, the title and the money, but make sure you're not compromising yourself. And if you feel that way, then you have some power. I love that. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And this has just been an amazingly important discussion. As product folks, we have a big role to play in building equitable products. It sometimes takes diligence and intention, but it's critical. And I certainly hope that we all can start to embrace that part of the product manager role. Carrie Jenkins, Amanda DiDio, thank you so much for the conversation and for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for having us. This is amazing. And I'm so excited for all who are listening to take little nuggets and embed that into their everyday if they possibly can, and with their teams.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, that's my hope with these podcast episodes is that, just a little bit of a nugget of wisdom from each one. So you guys have definitely imparted some of that. And I greatly appreciate you being here. And thank you all for joining us on Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks. I am JJ Rory, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.
You've been listening to Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks. If you'd like to take your career to the next level with additional tools, training, coaching, and books, be sure to visit Sequent Learning Networks at sequentlearning.com.